Welcome back to Future of Global Trade, and we are focusing on emerging trade corridors. So, Anis, how do you see India, making its presence felt in this changing economic scenario where opportunities are tremendous, but India also needs to move up significantly. It needs to up its game in terms of remaining competitive.
Right. I think James made a very interesting point. The fact is trade equations are changing around the world, and this is not happening over the 30-year period. This is perhaps something we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, when we look at trade equations changing, from an Indian perspective, again, we have to focus on what is it that is really changing. And interestingly, ASEAN countries, again, something James mentioned, the kind of focus India has had on these countries, particularly look east, look towards Asia, has really gone up. The Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, for example, with Japan, and
right.
that is already in place, and with Korea as well. India's negotiating a tough environment, let me put it that way, particularly on the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with Thailand and Malaysia. Services is really something which is an Indian engine of growth at this point of time, and India really needs to break into these countries from a services perspective, because right now that is not happening.
Right.
And we've seen our Prime Minister visit Thailand, a lot of FTA negotiations happening around that area, and clearly focused on saying, look, in India, if services is really what our main strength is, let's get that out there. Let's get it to people who will really recognize that, and that will help Indian growth.
Right. So, James, I think one of the critical aspects to this is also going to be this whole debate on nearshoring. Mm-hmm. For example, we've seen how Mexico has actually, made the most of its proximity to the U.S.
Yep.
They have these free trade zones from which they have really boosted their exports into the U.S. So how critical is nearshoring going to be from an Indian perspective as well? If you're an Indian manufacturer, I need to be closer to my markets. Is that a necessity now?
Well, I think there's two key angles to that question. One is the developed markets still present a very significant opportunity for companies out of India and elsewhere, certainly whether it's proximity to or location in. So if you think about the European Union, clearly a location in some of the Eastern European countries is a significant opportunity and presents a significant trade corridor in its own right. But nearshoring is a very relevant discussion, driven in particular by a diaspora of factories out of southern China, where you're seeing an increase in wages, which has been very significant of late. So the Maquiladora story that you refer to in Mexico is absolutely relevant and should be relevant to Indian companies and indeed to anyone looking at how do I best invest in NAFTA and build a presence there.
Right. So, Gopal, from your perspective, how do you see Indian companies actually doing it? I mean, is it through partnerships? Is it through subsidiaries? What is the preferred route that you think Indian companies are going to be taking to build these nearshore facilities?
I think Indian companies, have been having a couple of strategies. They have been acquiring. There's a huge amount of outward bound FDI which is happening from India, and that is currently driven to acquire resources.
Right.
Means in the coal and the mining sector. But we see that changing. If you look at the service industry, it's a very different approach. There has been a value specialization which has happened as far as the Indian industry is concerned, and then they have gone ahead and tapped the market. So I think it's a twofold approach, and as they become competitive, I think we will see more and more Indian companies having presence in different parts of the world.
Right. So, Susanto, you wanted to add to what Gopal just said.
There are many countries where onshore, not about nearshore, onshore presence is compulsory in certain kind of segments in the pharma. And that is taken care of when we basically strategize, or any pharma company will strategize to get into an emerging market. They will have to strategize looking at the particular market, the specific policies which guide the market, and the regulatory timings attached to it. So every country behave in different ways and this is all about trying to basically give employment to their citizens.
Right.
It's about trying to basically bring up the GDP in that particular country, reduce the imports, because you got to see these developing economies from a foreign exchange perspective, right?
Right.
They are not strong currencies. So obviously they don't want to rely upon imports too much.
Right.
So they want to get into the value add as quickly as possible. And obviously it involves tech transfers. Once the tech transfer happens in a particular generic situation, right, it becomes easy for them to replicate that particular technology.
In fact, that's a very interesting point, how countries are also trying to protect their own interests. In fact, from that, I want to ask a larger question to the two trade experts. I'll start with James and then come to Anis. If you look at the crisis that happened in 2008, after that, the WTO talks have pretty much, ended in a deadlock. There's no movement happening on that front. The world is now divided into two camps: the developing world camp and the developed world camp, each trying to protect their own interests. Now, to your mind, is there significant risk of barriers within, each of these groups going up and then that becoming a hindrance to global trade?
I think what's surprising over the crisis period, or post-crisis period, depending on how you look at it, is that we haven't seen barriers growing up. In fact, what we've seen is a proliferation of free trade agreements. But as you rightly point out, they're not in the multilateral context. They're bilateral and plurilateral.
Right.
And the important thing is that we can plug those in due course into that overall global round as and when it progresses. But trade will continue to be done. And actually, I think that's very powerful. Actually, the opportunity is to identify those future trade corridors that are so very significant.
Right. So, Anis, what's your take on the barriers, trade barriers?
This is a very interesting question, and let me take you back to 2008, when really the last progress, if I may put it that way, around the Doha talks happened. I think we are at a point in time where really these multi-country, multilateral agreements, perhaps getting people in place to talk together, is over. The reason being, it's not just about trade and economics, it's also about politics. Let me talk about the key issue when about the Doha round breaking down, and that was safeguard mechanisms around agriculture. If you look at agriculture, from an India's perspective, and India played a very major part there, agriculture is not even in the top 5 list of traded items, from an export perspective, from an import perspective. But it has a different story to say, which is the political side. So clearly, after a point of time when these talks break down, the question is economics doesn't stop. That has to continue, and that's exactly what is happening, because if you're looking at the free trade agreements that India signed, the bilateral investment agreement with the EU that it's negotiating, the kind of, I mentioned about the economic partnership agreements with the ASEAN countries, there's a lot of that happening.
So we will continue our discussion on world trade and bilateral trade in the next segment that's coming up after this short break. Stay with us.